This is Keith Thompson of Reformed Apologetics Ministries. In this video I am going to be explaining how Aron should not be attempting to address Christian teaching or church history, since he has proven that his grasp of such issues is terrible. This is not meant to be an attack on his character as a person, but rather his claims, countless of which are frankly absurd. This video is protected under fair use for the purpose of criticism.
You don't. You believe in a truth that is established by a subjective being, okay, which you try to externalize, but even if it was external, it would still be subjective, not objective. Objective means we all agree on it.
Objective does not mean everyone agrees on something. It means something is true, apart from individual sense or judgment. Something could be objectively true even if all the minds on the earth for some reason did not agree on it. For example, the Oxford Companion to Philosophy posits fish having fins is an objective truth, and its truth is independent of what anyone thinks about it. Page 631. I doubt that every child, handicapped person, or psychotic believes fish have fins. Yet, everyone not agreeing does not impede fish having fins from being objectively true. As for Christian truth being grounded in God, and that being subjective and not objective, this is false. Truth of God is not based on what God thinks or feels. That is what subjectivism is. That is not what we say determines truth. Instead, truth is based on God's eternal, unchanging holy nature. That is what defines truth. It would only be subjective if it were based on God's arbitrary thinking or feelings, which is not what we say. In his defense of shredding babies to death in the womb, that is abortion, Aron says that the Talmud says life does not begin at conception, teachings which he claims are truly based on the Old Testament position.
And it's funny that they should base these kind of decisions, where they say that, life begins at conception and so forth. And they want to base this on the Bible because, in fact, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible is based on Hebrew traditions, which can be found in the Talmud and other sources, in which, according to the Jewish law, on which the laws of Moses are based, and interrelated, I think probably more appropriate way to say that, the Hebrew tradition is that life, or that a fetus up to 45 days, is judged as only water, and that after that, a fetus is treated as a limb of the mother until birth. It is at the point of birth when the body becomes infused with the living soul, and the living soul was taken to be the breath of life, literally breathing. And the infant does not qualify as a living being until it breathes. As a matter of fact, there are Jewish texts, I believe it is in the Talmud, I can't remember exactly where, wherein it describes, when necessary, the process of partial birth abortion.
However, the Talmud post-dates the Old Testament by a great margin. In fact, it was compiled in the 3rd to the 5th centuries AD. To claim because some rabbi in the Talmud says something, that means that position is truly reflected in the Old Testament, is erroneous. The Old Testament is clear that life begins at conception and not birth. In Exodus 21:22, an unborn child is shown to have personhood, since it is called a child or yeled, and not merely a fetus, that is a nepal or golem. Moreover, Exodus 21:22-25 presupposes an unborn child has value and is alive, and not just water, since that text says a man who strikes a woman causing a miscarriage of an unborn baby is to be put to death on the principle of a life for a life. Thus, the unborn baby is a living person at conception.
Look at, okay, how about the one where Isaiah said that a woman would give birth to a virgin and call him Ishmael or whatever. It wasn't the name, but they didn't call him Jesus.
A woman would give birth to a virgin named Ishmael? You mean a virgin will give birth to Emmanuel? Yeah, that's in Isaiah 7:14. and for a convincing discussion proving this Emmanuel refers to a future messianic figure and not someone at the time of Isaiah's writing, see D.A. Carson's commentary on Matthew, pages 79 to 80. Why was the name Emmanuel and not Jesus? This is because Emmanuel means God with us, and that's what people said about Christ during his life. See Luke 7:16. The prophecy is indicating the child to be born by the Virgin is divine. See Murray J. Harris, Jesus as God, pages 256 to 258, for a thorough discussion proving that exegetically.
That practice, and I try to give demonstrations of how we don't. Now, we have evidence that the laws of physics have been constant so far as we can detect up to this point. That's evidence, that's not faith. So you ask me, how do I know? I have the evidence. That's how I know. And so
to argue you know the future will be like the past because you have evidence of past futures being like the past does not address the problem of induction. The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell already refuted Aron Ra's argument and noted past futures only tell us about the past. They don't tell us anything about future futures. So it is Aron Ra who has blind conviction without reason for the future being like the past. The atheist cannot account for why he assumes the future will be like the past. The Christian worldview does account for this by noting that the atheist actually knows God deep down and depends on him, which is why he doesn't worry reality or physics will spiral out of control tomorrow.
I'm not just an atheist, I'm also an epistemist. Now, an epistemist is one who rejects faith as being the most dishonest position it is possible to have. And it doesn't matter what source you look at to look it up. If you compare different definitions from scriptural references, from hymns, from sermons of theologians past and present, so forth, you're going to get a consensus definition. There is a second definition that exists only in a dictionary, which is a secure confidence in a person, place, or thing, and the value or the trustworthiness of that thing. But that definition appears only in the dictionary. It doesn't appear in the religious references. In the religious references, faith is a belief that you assume. It's a secure conviction that is assumed without reason and defended against all reason.
The biblical meaning of faith is not a blind conviction without reason. Aron Ra wants to assert the Bible suggests this in regards to believing God's existence. However, the biblical teaching on pistis, that is the Greek word for faith, is not at all what this man claims. The BDAG lexicon, which is the standard today, gives 5 meanings of the word pistis in the Bible depending on the context of a passage. 1. To consider something to be true and therefore worthy of one's trust. 2. To entrust oneself to an entity in complete confidence in regards to total commitment. 3. To entrust something to someone. 4. To be confident about. 5. Think or consider possible. None of these say anything about blind conviction without reason. No scholarly lexicon of which I am aware says pistis for biblical writers meant blind confidence without reason. Concerning the biblical teaching on faith in regards to soteriology or salvation, that is, saving faith, for example in Romans 3:25 and 5:1, this is a reliance or trust on the expiatory sacrifice of Christ for forgiveness of sins. Not a blind conviction of its historicity without reason. Those are two different things. For the New Testament writer, belief in the historicity of the crucifixion did not require blind conviction apart from reason, since they purported to have witnessed that event or known people who witnessed it. Therefore, faith in Christ's sacrifice was not meant to be what Aron Ra asserts. In regards to the biblical teaching on faith in God, this concerns trust in God's promises, not blindly believing God's existence without reason. The biblical position is all men already know innately that God exists based on nature, being in God's image and common grace. See Romans 1:17-23, Psalms 14:1 and Psalms 19:1. Not that blind conviction without reason is required in order to believe God exists. The Bible nowhere says to blindly accept God exists without reason as a definition of biblical faith. In regards to the common atheist misuse of Hebrews 11:1, which says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction or evidence of things not seen. The Greek word for conviction here, or evidence, as some translations render it, is alankos, and according to Lowe and Nita's lexicon it means the evidence normally based on argument or discussion as to the truth and reality of something, unquote. The BDAG lexicon agrees and defines it the same way. Therefore, because of this and the context of the passage, we must agree with the exegete Peter O'Brien and affirm this text is saying faith or trust demonstrates or proves the existence of unseen future eschatological truth in that we are between divine events. In other words, because people have faith in future eschatological truth based on encountering earlier divine events, the people's faith or trust is therefore evidence of that future unseen eschatological truth. It is in that sense that faith is alankos, or evidence of things not seen. Also, the biblical writers are not responsible for someone writing a hymn 1,000 years later misunderstanding this and defining faith some other way, or some modern English dictionary wrongly defining biblical faith in a way the Bible rejects. In his talks, Aron commonly bases his understanding of biblical faith on modern English dictionaries. This is a problem if you want to understand the biblical writers. To further prove biblical faith is not blind confidence apart from reason. In 1 John 4:16, John affirms he has faith in the context of knowing God's love for Christians through his, that is John's, life knowing Christ. This faith is not blind, but evidenced through him knowing Christ on the earth. In 2 Thessalonians 1:10, valid faith is defined as being based on what was affirmed by an eyewitness of the apostles, that is Paul. The whole reason the Bible teaches Jesus did miracles was so that he would prove who he is, and thus the believer's faith would not be in vain. As Christian scholar Robert Raymond says, quote, "The Bible insists faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ." Romans 10:7. Saving faith is based upon divine testimony. It knows nothing of the modern notion that faith is an enemy of knowledge, and that it repudiates all grounding in propositional truth. The Bible glories and delights in knowledge and propositional truth as the foundation of true faith, and characterizes faith devoid of knowledge as believing a lie, which leads to condemnation. 2 Thessalonians 2:11-12, unquote. Christian scholars aside from Robert Raymond agree on this meaning of faith, including B.B. Warfield, John Murray, Greg Bonson, and many, many others. I and other Reformed presuppositional folks believe in God because we are confident that he is the necessary precondition needed in order to account for valid human experience. Evidentialist Arminian and classical Arminian Christians believe their arguments and evidence warrant belief in God. So to characterize Christianity as a whole as holding to some blind faith apart from reason is a total caricature and a demonstration of Aron Ra's unwillingness to accurately represent Christianity.
The entire Christ narrative was invented by Paul some 20 years after the fact, and Jesus never existed to begin with. That's why there's no evidence of Christianity as a truth statement. There is no evidence of Jesus, the Christ character himself, that he ever lived at all.
This idea that Jesus never existed and was made up by Paul is absurd. When we apply to the Gospels the criteria for historicity that historians employ, we discover there are indisputable authentic sayings of Jesus. These are sayings which meet these historical criteria, such as multiple independent attestation, the principle of embarrassment, dissimilarity, Semitisms, etc. The fact Jesus' sayings in the Gospels meet these criteria is one of the reasons why no serious historian, classicist, or New Testament scholar, believing or unbelieving, who holds a university chair, ever says Jesus did not exist. I will cover one such statement that proves not only that Jesus existed and uttered these words, but that he predicted his own crucifixion and resurrection. In Mark 8:31, Jesus said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again," unquote. The parallel text in Matthew 16:21-23 and Luke 9:22 are independent attestation. Moreover, in the immediate context, that is verses 32-33, Peter rebukes Jesus for saying he will die and rise, and then Jesus calls Peter Satan and tells him to get behind him. This embarrassing feature, where a leading apostle rebukes Christ, and where Christ calls this leading apostle Satan, is not likely to have been invented by the early church. This indicates it actually took place. Moreover, when Jesus calls himself Son of Man, This is dissimilar to how early Christians identified him. See Lycona's tome, The Resurrection of Jesus, for proof on that. There are also Semitisms which validate the authenticity of this saying of Christ. This is but one of many examples of sayings of Christ that meet the criteria for historicity that historians employ, and which prove Jesus existed and said such things. Moreover, as the Christian debater in the clip I played said, in his response to Aron Ra, the idea Paul invented Jesus is contradicted by the fact that Paul's creed about Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-8 contains technical rabbinic terms denoting the transmission of earlier oral teaching. Critical scholars, therefore, such as James D.G. Dunn and others, date this creed very closely to the time of his crucifixion. And they would never say Paul invented it. That's absurd. Aron Ra's absurd position is clear evidence that this man does not want Jesus to exist, and not that he is sure he didn't based on sound arguments.
That's the fact. You either base your position on evidence or you base it on faith. I base mine on evidence.
Leaving aside Aron Ra's misrepresentation of biblical faith, it must be said that he does not base his position on evidence or empirical observation. I'm sure he bases many things on them, but not everything he believes in. In his book The Doctrine of the Knowledge of God, the philosopher John Frame explains such a method is too limited in regards to human experience. For if we base our positions on evidence only, and not transcendental reasoning or presupposition, then we would have to abandon many positions we would otherwise hold without hesitation. For example, this method can't justify general propositions like all men are mortal, for that goes beyond what someone or some team can observe. Moreover, this method cannot justify statements about the future. This goes back to the problem of induction. Nor can this method justify what is good or bad in regards to ethics. Yet Aron Ra doesn't hesitate to say things are either good or bad. So he does not base all his beliefs on evidence or empirical observation. Thus, when Aron Ra said in his debate with Seitan Bruggencate that, quote, if it can't be measured, it is not real, unquote, he shows the weakness of his worldview.
Why would a just deity require parents to sell their daughter to a rapist?
Deuteronomy 22, 28-29, which is what he's talking about, says, quote, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and shall be his wife because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days, unquote. Aron Ra's misunderstanding of this text permits rape. However, this is incorrect since the text is not talking about rape. The text is referring to consensual willing encounters between men and virgins, as we will prove, based on the context, original language, and lexical analysis. Deuteronomy 22, 23-29 discusses 3 moral crimes. 1. Adultery between 2 adults who consent, verses 23-24. 2. Forcible rape of an engaged virgin, verses 25-27. And 3. Consensual fornication with an unengaged virgin after seduction, verses 28-29. Aron Ra is alleging scenario 3 is rape. However, first, when rape is actually discussed in verses 25-27, not the text in view, the punishment for the man is execution. Thus, it is erroneous for Aron Ra to claim the Bible allows rape. Second, it is clear verses 28-29, the text in view, is referring to a consensual sexual encounter and not rape, since verse 28 says, if they are found, which literally means her and they are discovered, suggesting willing participation from both parties. It does not say, if he is found. As Old Testament scholar Edward J. Woods points out, quote, the terminology here is different than in the case of rape in verses 25-27, which points rather to a case of seduction with the expression, and they are discovered, verse 28b. If they are discovered, then the man is obligated to marry the girl and is prevented from ever divorcing her, verse 29b. Third, further evidence verses 28-29 does not refer to rape is the fact that you have a parallel text in Exodus 22:16, which is without question not about rape, but seduction, and the penalty is the exact same as in Deuteronomy 22, 28-29, the text in view. Exodus 22:16 says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife, unquote. Thus, this parallel text or backdrop demonstrates Deuteronomy 22:28-29 likewise concerns consensual relations and not rape. Fourth, when rape is actually discussed in verse 25, the Hebrew word for forces indicating rape is taking place is shazak, which carries the meaning of a firm or strong forcefulness. However, this word is not even used in verses 28-29, the text in question. Instead, two words are used here, tafas when it says lay hold on her in verse 28, and anach when it says he humbled her in verse 29. Regarding the first one, tafas, it can mean to lay hold of or handle without there necessarily being any force according to scholarly lexicons and word dictionaries, such as Vine's. The same word is used in Genesis 4:21 of someone who lays hold on a harp and plays it. The concept of force is absent. It is also used in Jeremiah 2:8 of handling or laying hold of the law or Torah in a teaching situation. Again, there is no firm or strong forcefulness here. Thus, in Deuteronomy 22:28, the man lays hold on or handles the virgin in a non-forceful, consensual way. In regards to the second one, anach, the word is often translated here as humbled her or violated her, with the meaning that her virginity has been defiled. Mounce's Complete Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament Words notes that the word can refer to consensual encounters in which a woman's virginity is lost. Deuteronomy 21:14, Deuteronomy 22:24, and 29, unquote. Notice this scholarly source affirms Deuteronomy 22:29's use of anach refers not to rape, as Aron Ra alleges, but to virginity being lost in a consensual situation. James Strong's Exhaustive Concordance of the Bible supports this by affirming the word can mean defile. Deuteronomy 21:14 supports this, since the same word is used there in the context of a woman having her virginity taken in a non-rape marriage situation. That is, it is an example of the same word being employed to convey virginity being lost without rape or strong force being involved. This backs our case concerning Deuteronomy 22:29. Fifth, and lastly, Aron Ra doesn't realize that when this text says a man must marry the virgin who he had consensual relations with, having thus defiled her virginity, anach, marrying the man is the best thing for the woman. For if she did not marry him, then no one else would marry her, because the culture was very strict in regards to purity and virginity. Being defiled before marriage was a very grievous shame, so much so that the woman would be viewed as an outcast and unable to support herself. Thus, it is for the sake of the woman's own survival and well-being that this law in verses 28-29 dictated the man marries and stays with her forever after defiling her virginity. So notice how this scum takes a good teaching and twists it into something perverted, because his mind is perverse.
Christianity began with the Gnostic faith, and then the Docetics and Ebionites, and their completely different perspectives of Jesus were eventually combined into a kind of compromise called orthodoxy.
Although Aron Ra asserts that the Ebionites are 1st century, real scholars like Ron Cameron date the Gospel of the Ebionites to the mid-2nd century. In his work The Other Gospels, Non-Canonical Gospel Texts, he remarks, quote, "The Gospel of the Ebionites was composed sometime after the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, and before the first reference to it in the writings of Irenaeus toward the end of the 2nd century. A date of composition in the middle of the 2nd century, when several other Gospel harmonies were also being written, is most likely," unquote. Cameron also notes that the Ebionites were, quote, "a group of Greek-speaking Jewish Christians who were prominent throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries," unquote. Jeffrey W. Bromley notes that the Ebionites were, quote, "flourishing in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries AD," unquote. In the same work, Bromley also dates the Gospel of the Ebionites to the 2nd century. In his work Apocryphal Gospels, Hans Joseph Klock states that the Gospel of the Ebionites was, quote, "composed most probably in the mid-2nd century," unquote. It is widely acknowledged that there is no firm historical material proving that the Ebionite sect dates to the 1st century. So to say Christianity borrowed from them is just the opposite of what is true. The Ebionites were a deviation from 1st century Christianity. They were a 2nd century sect which created a false gospel, plagiarizing and distorting sections of the canonical Gospels. In his detailed treatment on the subject, world-class scholar Joseph A. Fitzmyer sums up the current scholarly consensus, quote, There is simply no evidence of their, the Ebionites, existence in the 1st century AD, either before or after the destruction of Jerusalem, unquote. This is amazing, since Aron Ra claims to be all about evidence. I guess that's only true when it doesn't involve trying to refute Christianity. As for the Docetists, the Professor D. Larry Gregg notes that they are late 1st century. In his essay in the book Paul in the 2nd Century, Carl B. Smith affirms Docetism emerged in the late 1st century, based on dating the earliest polemics that refute them. And because of their presupposition that the physical world was evil, they perverted earlier Orthodox truth and denied Jesus' physicality and opted for a phantom Jesus. However, this late 1st century belief is a perversion of the early 1st century belief that Jesus was physical and died a physical death for sins. We know this physical belief is the earlier belief because we have mid and late 1st century creedal formulations containing technical rabbinic terms denoting the transmission of earlier oral tradition. For example, again in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-8, we see affirmation of Jesus' physical death for sins in a creedal formulation using technical language denoting the passing of oral transmission. The British biblical scholar Michael Goulder states of 1 Corinthians 15, quote, that it goes back to at least to what Paul taught when he was converted, a couple of years after the crucifixion, unquote. Professor Ulrich Wilkins states that this material in the creed, quote, undoubtedly goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity, unquote. The scholar Walter Casper contends that this creed was circulating by the end of 30 AD. The notable atheist New Testament critic Gert Ludemann stated, quote, the elements in this tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion, not later than 3 years after the death of Jesus, unquote. Liberal critical scholar James D.G. Dunn states, quote, this tradition we can be entirely confident was formulated as a tradition within months of Jesus' death, unquote. Reginald Fuller stated, it is almost universally agreed today that Paul is here citing oral tradition. In his 1999 work, The Acts of Jesus, page 466, the radical liberal Jesus Seminar co-founder Robert Funk states that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed was formulated within, quote, 2 or 3 years at most, unquote, after Jesus' crucifixion. And 1 Corinthians itself is dated earlier than Docetism. Moreover, while Docetists denied Christ assumed a real human form, Paul in Romans 1:3-4 affirms Jesus was born from the seed of David according to the flesh. According to the flesh, or sarx, refers to true human existence. This is an oral formulation that, as many scholars argue, goes back to the early Jerusalem church, which existed way before Docetism. There are 7 features of this text that lead scholars to this conclusion. James D.G. Dunn covers them in his 2002 Form and Structure. These features include Semitisms, untypical Pauline terms, relative clauses in antithetic parallelism, etc. Other formulations that contradict Docetism and go back to the early part of the 1st century, which predate all New Testament literature, include Luke 24:33-34, the God raised Jesus from the dead sayings found in 26 texts, and the twofold statement of Jesus' death and resurrection found in 13 texts. So there really is no question that Docetism post-dates Orthodox Christian belief.
The rest of what became the New Testament was canonized in the 4th century in a series of committee decisions at the convention in Nicaea. 4 Gospels were accepted, and 16 more were rejected, all by a show of hands, as if the facts of the matter could be evaluated or dismissed by popular vote.
I challenge Aron Ra to cite even one serious historian who says the Council of Nicaea in AD 325 had anything to do with the canon whatsoever, or who thinks that there's any meaningful evidence for that. There is no meaningful evidence that would prove this is the case. In fact, historians note the councils of Hippo and Carthage address the canon, not arbitrarily selecting books and rejecting tons of others, as Aron Ra posits, but using sound criteria such as apostolicity, orthodoxy, usage, and if a book was written in the 1st century. The canon was essentially agreed upon in the Christian communities in the 200s, and there were not dozens of other books the Christian community were seriously considering. This is a myth. This is not even a dispute among scholars. All serious scholars affirm Nicaea had nothing to do with the canon. This is the type of garbage that Dan Brown says in his fictional Da Vinci Code book. I will cite real historians who affirm Nicaea had nothing to do with the canon, but that Hippo and Carthage did. Philip Schaff, History of the Christian Church, Volume 2, page 519. J.N.D. Kelly, Early Christian Doctrines, page 56. Greg Allison, Historical Theology, page 50. Bart Ehrman, Lost Scriptures, page 341, etc. And as Bart Ehrman states in another work, quote, "The Council of Nicaea did not deal with the matter of canon," unquote. Truth and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code, page 93. To make such an elementary error when all the scholarly literature on the canon confirms Hippo and Carthage settled it, and that Nicaea had nothing to do with it, shows that Aron Ra should not be trying to critique Christianity. Thanks for watching.